I'm Leanne Tran, psychologist who's worked with families whose kids don't fit the mould for almost 20 years. I've worked with children for decades, but I know parents are the real change makers when it comes to their kids. Having 3 kids of my own means I know it's not easy. Parent Like a Psychologist is all about simplifying how you support your kids with psychology information filtered through years of experience to take you from overwhelmed to confident. Come on in. Welcome to another episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. Today is another book review episode, they're one of my favorites. I love to read, as you know, but also by reading these books that are about children and parenting, it helps me reflect on all of the knowledge I've got and the experience I've had, and be able to bring that as well as the information I've learned in the book to you as well. So I think that's one of the reasons I'm forever reading books about kids and parenting and self-help. And this is a book that's been on my list to be read for a long time. It's called The Gardner and the Carpenter by Alison Gopnik. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. It's about what the new science of child development tells us about the relationship between parents and children. I should say that it sounds like it's new, but it was published in 2016, so not incredibly new, but new enough that the science of child development in there will still stand as current. I'll read a bit about Alison Gopnik. She's a professor of psychology and an affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She's an internationally recognized leader in the study of children's learning and development. And she writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal, and has written other books called The Philosophical Baby, and co-author of The Scientist in the Crib. I think The Scientist in the Crib is along similar lines to this one. It's about the science of development and growth of children. But The Gardner and the Carpenter really points to the theme of the book, that as parents, really thinking about being a gardener that tends to our child as a flower rather than a carpenter molding our child into something like a piece of wood into a table is much more aligned with what science and research tells us works. So I heard about this at a conference a few years ago and thought that idea sounded really interesting. And so the book has been in my pile of things to read since then. A few bits stuck out to me. I think, first of all, Alison goes through, some of the science about love and learning. And because love is what underlies the relationships that we have, she talks about also how the first relationship, really that attachment relationship that helps a child, is the one between its parents. So that's how much these things permeate our families. It talks about the evolution of childhood. So that's really interesting to think about what childhood was like through different generations and how that's changed. One of the concepts, I guess, is that there was a lot less known about parenting back years and years ago. Now there's a lot more, but it's swung the way that it could be incredibly confusing for parents to know which one to follow, which kind of method of parenting to follow, and whether they're doing it right or not getting it right. Interestingly, one of the points in the book is about how the research doesn't support the idea that one method or modality or philosophy of parenting will produce any different outcomes than the others. So it's showing us that really there are some things that are not good parenting, abuse, neglect, all of those things. But in terms of the parenting approach you take, whether it be gentle parenting or other ones, does not really lead to predictable differences in outcomes in children as they grow. So I think that summary of all of the information out there as it relates to the research is really interesting and I think reassuring. I certainly felt reassured as a parent when I read that. Uh, she talks about the evolution of love as well. And so that comes into, you know, how those relationships start and how we transfer that into loving our children. She also talks about how kids learn. And so one of the big ways they learn is through looking, as she talks about. So there's some bits I highlighted in that felt really relevant. Kids learn through watching, in particular imitating, and kids imitate our intended actions. They imitate them more as well in the context of a really good relationship with us. So that shows that, how children learn often is just by watching us. So there's nothing in particular we need to do in order to be able to teach them, except that having a good relationship with our kids maximizes that learning. They also learn, so it talks about how kids too learn from older generations, and they put this together with their own learning and new learning in order to evolve and change from generation to generation. So that is reassuring when we think about it in the context of us as parents not needing to be able to teach them all the ways to solve all the problems they're going to encounter in their lives. Our job is to teach them what we can, and they will learn from other places and other people as well, and combine all that knowledge in order to be able to solve the problems they face into their adult lives. So it takes a little bit of the pressure off us in that way. What else is there? So she talks about too that children learn through listening. So she talks about, the impact of how we talk to kids about things and how sure we are can shape then who else they might listen to and believe and be confident in when they're going through school and that kind of thing. So it gives a bit of insight for us as to our role in talking with kids about lots of things. She talks about play as well. And so there's about the work of play, how some of it's rough and tumble, getting into everything. Hello, toddler stage, everything's messy. Making believe, different kinds of minds, and even there are some really interesting examples she draws on from studies that show that how parents interact with toys and things can change how kids interact with them as well. So one of the great bits about the book is those examples from the scientific study she's done at the University of California, Berkeley. And one that I remember was kids playing with a toy that had different functions, and whether adults showed curiosity about whether the toy would work affected how kids interacted with it. If the caregivers or people doing the experiment said no, that doesn't work, or whether they said, I wonder if it works, let's see, skewed how the kids interacted with the toy. So that chapter, the work of play, is really, really interesting. If you've got little kids, it's a great time to read it, even for bigger kids. And particularly if you feel like you don't really find it easy to play with your kids, could be really worth reading the chapter and learning a bit about how kids experience play, so how you can facilitate some good play that will lead to them learning and problem solving. She talks next about growing up, so going through apprenticeship, and that's not actually about apprenticeship the way we think about it in the job context, but it's more about how kids can learn from a master. So whatever particular skill it is that they want to learn, or whether there's things your kids are looking to you for, that experience of teaching kids in the way of an apprentice master or master, I don't know what you call it, is something that you can think about. So how they teach kids is to they always are looking for kids or their apprentices to get it right. And so part of it is having a go. The apprentice has a go, and then the master looks and says, no, that's not quite right, and gives it back to the apprentice to have another go. And that process continues and continues until the apprentice becomes the master, I guess, and they master that skill. So it's really interesting to understand that concept in terms of another way that kids learn and develop skills. She talks about also the some of the challenges through adolescence as well, and how it's really balancing those two different priorities, I guess, of family and then the peer group and becoming an individual. I think she's got another chapter on the value of play as well, which is really interesting. I don't know if you can hear that, but one of my children is playing on the piano right now as we speak. So that's a way that they muck around and play on a Friday afternoon. I think this book has got a lot of gold in there, but it's not one that's particularly easy to get through. I've talked about other books that I think are a lot more accessible because of they kind of simplify all of the scientific research and stuff, and give really practical tips. This one, I think, reflects a bit more about how Alison is a professor in philosophy as well, or works in the philosophy department. It's a lot more about the ways of thinking about parenting rather than talking about practical strategies. I think, though, that really reflects the title in that, parenting books that kind of tell us exactly what to do and how to do it reflects that Carpenter mode of trying to shape us to be a particular kind of parent. And if we use that approach with our kids, we're trying to shape them to be maybe the product we have in our mind of them in the future, or our idea of the person that we want them to be. But Alison's whole point throughout the book is that our kids are already the person that they're going to be. We don't have as much control over that as we think. So parenting really isn't about trying to shape our kids into some future ideal that we have. They already are their own person, and it's our job to be, she talks about it being gardeners, as in we don't know what they're going to bloom into, but all we can do is, tend to the garden. So create a really good environment, look after whatever it is that's growing, whoever our child is, try and be responsive to what they need, much like we water a flower or we make sure they have enough sun. It's just tending to the needs and looking after it is what the flower needs to grow into itself, into what it already is. And so I think in that way, then I see the parallels that this book is not really a how-to guide, because that would be a carpentry guide. It's more about just telling us lots of information that we can use and take as we see fit to do with our families and implement what we think that our individual kids need. So I really liked the book. It's one that might change your perspective and philosophy on parenting more than it will give you practical tips. And so it felt heavy in the way that there was a lot of science in the book, but didn't feel heavy in giving lots of things I had to do. So it was a bit heavy in the science, but if you break it up, it was all right. But gave me this sense of just being able to enjoy the book rather than have it be an academic exercise where I had to then, write a to-do list based on all of the recommendations. The last thing I want to say is it was really interesting in talking about the last chapter is it talks about not the last chapter almost, but the future and the past, children and technology. And so it's really interesting talking about the way that society has changed and evolved over the last couple of decades, particularly in terms of technology, and that we see that as our job to try to curtail, I think, with our kids and fix how they do things. But Alison talks through how there have been other changes to things like, back in a long time ago, people couldn't read. Now they can read. Now there's access to a lot more information. And so those were things that we had to deal with, or our parents had to deal with and struggle with as the changes happened. And we've dealt with technology and its impact on our lives now, but for our children, that will be their responsibility to work out as that generation how they're going to manage that as a society. So we can teach them about things that we know, like how having limits is good on technology, how the impact we already know it has on things like physical health and mental health from social media and all of that kind of stuff. And we can teach them the ways we know how to cope and manage it. But those bits that we might feel overwhelmed with as a generation to be able to pass on might not be up to us. It might be up to the next generation to solve some of those challenges themselves with the information they've got from us and also what they learn by, talking with each other and studying lots of these things and researching these areas. So it's really interesting it shifted my perspective on some of that stuff a little bit. Don't get me wrong, we still have screen time limits and boundaries and all of that stuff. Nothing I do practically has changed, but it's maybe alleviated some of the fear that I had as to how the next generation is going to handle this ever-changing, rapidly changing world. So a really interesting read. I really shouldn't have put it off for so long. I don't know why I did, but it's one that I would recommend as well if you're interested in thinking about the ideas about parenting and want to learn how kids learn, and then feel informed and confident to be able to make your own choices about the parenting that you want to do. So The Gardner and the Carpenter by Alison Gopnik. It's available most places and also on audiobook as well for those people doing a lot of school run driving. So let me know how you go with it. Really interested to have a discussion with anyone who has read it because I don't know other people who have yet. So if you have read it or do, get in touch because I'd love to hear what you think about it. Thanks so much for joining in again today, and I look forward to connecting with you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. If you found it helpful, please share on Instagram so other parents can benefit too, and tag me at Leanne Tran Psychology so that I can say a big thank you. Head over to leannetran.com.au to join the village for bite-sized psychology tips straight to your inbox. I really hope this podcast has brought a new perspective and you a step closer towards a calm parent and a thriving child. Have a delightful day.